So now that we have audio and we are ready to go with the impact of fantastical fauna and floras on cultures in a fantasy world. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the role of fantastical animals in myths and legends. And for that, we don't even need to go so far as any published fantasy worlds. We just need to look at our own world. So we have creation myths in our world that speak to fantastical creatures. For example, there is the rainbow serpent of Africa that created, according to the legend, created the world by he's slithered through the land and thereby created the valleys, and his poop became mountains. So that is an actual creation spirit. We also have destruction or apocalypse spirits that have actually destroyed the world. And an example of this is Jormungandr, which is the serpent from up north, from here where I live, which encircles the world. It encircles the whole of Midgard and can grasp its own tail. Now, at the end of the world, what's supposed to happen is the serpent lets go its tail, Thor and releases acid poison into the environment. Thor destroys said serpent, and then it takes 9 steps before collapsing and dying from the venom. Thor, I mean. So having creatures like this, unique creatures like this, can form a central part of either your creation myths or potentially your destruction myths, or they could serve as advisors to your heroes, as the centaur did in the myth of Jason and the Argonauts. You have the centaur, whose name escapes me right this minute, who advises the heroes on their quest. So those kinds of almost unique mythic animals can greatly impact on your legends and myths, as people don't necessarily assume that these things exist, although I think that, you know, they did back when they believed in these things and commonly told these stories. But it's not so much about these things actually existing, like physically finding them. It's about these animals embodying parts of the culture that they then become part of this myth that the culture tells. So when you're creating some kind of fantastical animals, don't forget about creating actual mythical animals that might or might not be real in your world. But the important thing is not whether they're real. The important part of that equation of animals in this kind of myths and legends scenario is, are these animals impactful on the mythic culture? What do they embody? The rainbow spirit embodies creation. The serpent that grasps its tail, Jormungandr, it embodies destruction. So think about what you want these myths to embody and make mythical creatures that match your culture in that way. So that's myths and legends and kind of fauna and flora's role there. But there are also a much vaster role for fantasy fauna and flora in cultural impacts. And one of the first ways in which many cultures use it is in religious and spiritual practices that are orientated around a specific type of fauna and flora, either a spirit or a specific kind of animal. Now, again, we have examples of this from our world, where, for example, the cow is holy in the Hindu religion. In the same way, you can have animals that are not necessarily magical, but that are considered holy in a given religion. But you can also take it further. You can create a religion where you have a spirit or a specific magical animal that is tied to the god or gods and contributes to guiding people along their paths. And a good example of this comes from Mercedes Lackey's world. Now, in Mercedes Lackey, there are two types of animals specifically that I refer to in terms of the religion and the guiding of spiritual animals in this religion. And the first is the very obvious example of fire cats that we see in the Mage Storm trilogy. So in the Mage Storm trilogy, one of the POV characters, point of view characters, Carl, gets this fire cat visitor. And he later figures out that fire cats are actually old Son of the Suns, kind of the leader of their religion. It's Son of the Suns who have been reborn into this almost spiritual but still physical fire cat form. And they come to guide the people of the religion of Kars who need this specific kind of guidance. So it is worth thinking about, if you have such animals who are so obviously intelligent, where they come from in terms of their magic. Now, Mercedes Lackey has reincarnation in her world, which is what allows her to make these animals with a reborn, but with a human soul, effectively. It's part of like a reincarnation cycle. She does the same thing with companions of the Voldemort heralds. Now, these, interestingly, are not directly tied to a given religion, although they do refer to the gods in this aspect. They are tied specifically to the land of Voldemort, where they embody all the best virtues of the land of Voldemort, and they choose the heralds out of the human population who help keep the laws of Voldemort and kind of keep Voldemort as a strong and functioning place where people are well looked after. That's the role the heralds play, and the companions kind of keep heralds on the straight and narrow by choosing the right people to be heralds and training them and so on. So the thing about heralds and companions is, again, it's about where does the animal come from? What is its role in the society? So in the case of the fire cats, their guidance. In the case of the companions, their guidance. So Mercedes Lackey leaned very heavily into that aspect of these spiritual animals as guides to the humans who then play the main role. They fill almost a mentorship role. So you can definitely use animals to have that kind of mentorship role. But that is not the only religion aspect that you need to have, or that you can have, with relation to your religion. You can also lean into having the animals or the fauna and flora simply be a part of the religion. And a great example of this is the weirwoods from George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire. So with the weirwoods specifically, we have this situation where they are a central part of the religious practice of the first men. Now I am going to switch to a second scene, and I am not sure if my sound is going to keep working, so I will add my microphone. And I hope that this is still working and that there are no echoes. If there are echoes, please tell me in the chat, or if the sound isn't working, please tell me in the chat. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the weirwoods here, and I'm going to specifically read some parts out of A Song of Ice and Fire. Okay. Doesn't look in the chat as though there's any issues, so I will go ahead and read this. So, this is out of A Song of Ice and Fire, Book 1, A Game of Thrones. And the first part is told from Catelyn's perspective. So, for her sake, Ned had built a small sept where she might sing to the 7 faces of God. But the blood of the first men still flowed in the veins of the Starks, and his own gods were the old ones, the nameless, faceless gods of the greenwood they shared with the vanished children of the forest. At the center of the grove, an ancient weirwood brooded over a small pool where the waters were black and cold. The heart tree, Ned called it. The weirwood's bark was white as bone, its leaves dark red like 1,000 blood-stained hands. A face had been carved in the trunk of the great tree, its features long and melancholy, its deep-cut eyes red with dried sap and watchful. Apologies about the echo. I will remove that. Should sort out the echo. Sorry, I didn't catch that in time. Essentially, what this whole section is about is showing what the weirwoods are and how important that grove is for Ned Stark. So, if you are going to build a kind of an outdoor temple, if you're going to lean into plants as your temple area, it's very important that you set up how these plants are established, what they look like, and how people interact with them. It's also interesting what Martin does here, because he very clearly separates the faith of the 7 from the faith of the first men, and yet has a marriage between 2 people who are of different faiths, showing that these 2 faiths do exist concurrently. So, if we look at the second paragraph that I took out of A Game of Thrones, the sun was sinking low below the trees when they reached their destination, a small clearing in the deep wood where 9 weirwoods grew in a rough circle. John drew in a breath, and he saw Sam Tarley staring. Even in the wolf's wood you never found more than 2 or 3 of the white trees growing together. A grove of 9 was unheard of. The forest floor was carpeted with fallen leaves, blood red on top, black rot beneath. The wide, smooth trunks were bone pale, and 9 faces stared inward. The dried sap that crusted in the eyes was red and hard as ruby. Bowen Marsh commanded them to leave their horses outside the circle. This is a sacred place. We will not defile it. So, what we can see from Chiron, thank you, Wirbis. What we can see from George R. R. Martin's setup here is that he is creating a temple from these trees, and it has a very direct impact on the culture. Even people who do not follow the practice of the first men, even people who are not part of that religion, still they regard the weirwoods as holy, and they treat it as a holy place. They don't ride their horses into a weirwood grove. And that's very important. If you are going to create a setup where you have people who worship in a specific kind of grove among certain plants, if you're going to set up a holy animal and have that animal be part of religious worship, it is very important that people respect those animals, that that fauna and flora, that they treat them with true respect. If you don't do that, you're going to come across as treating these people with contempt. You're going to come across as not sincere in the building of your religion. So while I would recommend utilizing animals or spirits or that kind of element in your religious world building, I do also very much recommend that you ensure that people in that culture also focus on ensuring that they actually give these animals and these people or these plants real respect, as we saw there in Martin's work. Okay, so that is with regards to our religious and spiritual practices. But there are also other ways in which our animals, our fauna and flora, can affect the people and their culture. And one of the ways in which that happens, obviously, is in terms of economic and social impacts. So if we look at economic impacts first, the animals, fauna and flora that you can create can have unique attributes and unique items that are used in trade. And these items could obviously make people who can domesticate these animals or control these animals or harvest these plants, if it's a plant-based thing, can make them fabulously wealthy. And if we look at Dune, that is an absolutely perfect example of this. The spice must flow is a central part of the whole Dune storyline. Not only that, but the possession of Arrakis is hotly contested because of the spice melange. Now, that is all very fine and well, but if you create such an animal, it is important to look at the way that, for example, Frank Herbert did it. If you create something that is so central to your economy that it is how people travel, there are going to be battles fought over this thing to an infinite degree. So you need to consider how valuable is this byproduct of the animal? Does it kill the animal? And how do the native culture, the culture that actually possesses the animal first, like the culture that lives in the environment where the animal lived first, how do they feel about the animal? So the Fremen of Dune, for example. And then compare that with how do other people who combat over the animal, how do they feel about that environment? It's also worth thinking about things like the roles that creatures and plants can play in daily life. So for an example of this, if you look at Pern by Anne McCaffrey, the fire lizards in the later books are trained to carry messages, and this has a rather dramatic impact on the world of Pern, because fire lizards can now carry messages across the world in 8 seconds. So this dramatically increases your communication between distant locations. And if your animal alters your communication methods, or if you have a plant that alters your communication methods, maybe you create a plant that can send telegrams between its spores or something like that. If you have instantaneous communication, your world changes a lot. And I mean a lot, because you suddenly have ideas spread across your globe at a much faster pace. And you have news spread across your globe at a much faster pace. So instead of the slow news of something happening over here and then it later spreads on to over here, you have near instantaneous spread of news. And your technology will probably start increasing quite dramatically as people are capable of exchanging ideas over a much larger area. When you have multiple people exchanging ideas, your technology starts snowballing in its development. So bear that in mind if you dramatically increase communication or travel across your world. You can also have animals that tie directly into your magic systems. Now, one of the examples of this is, of course, things like D&D familiars or trees that druids bond with, things like that. And it is interesting to look at some of those examples. So I'm going to take a look at Mercedes Lackey's Bond Bird example. So Mercedes Lackey, and she really used animals quite a lot, which is why I'm referencing her so much in this. She also had a whole plethora of plants that she created and so on, but the animals are very interesting. So what Mercedes Lackey did with bond birds is the people who have bond birds, they formed this link. I'm going to switch to the document and I'm going to check out Mercedes Lackey's bond birds. That was what I thought. Okay. Apparently you guys are a little bit behind me. All right, cool. Thanks, guys. Okay, so looking at bond birds. So this chapter starts with Snowfire, who is an adept who is bonded to a owl. So I'm just going to start sort of in the middle of it. Therefore, when Haweel, his bond bird, came flying silently out of the treetops, projecting urgent images of just that into his mind, Snowfire did not need to ponder diplomatic contingencies to make a decision. Haweel made one of his rare calls, warning him that he was coming down. The bird's call was a long, profound bass note, like a thunderous breath, deeper by far than the more common hoot of an owl of normal size and breeding. So she introduces the owl, and then there's the whole bit of the owl landing. But what is very interesting to me as well, and what I want to point out here, is that Haweel is capable of sending images to Snowfire's head, but also of actually telepathically communicating with Snowfire. And what I actually also just want to highlight is how she did the punctuation for telepathy. Notice that she didn't put actual punctuation marks on either side. She used colons, which I thought was a very interesting way of doing punctuation in terms of making it clear to the reader that this is actually telepathic communication. So just a clue if you're looking to make telepathic communication. Now, how she establishes bonds between these birds and the people who have the birds is they live with the birds, they almost tame the birds. These birds are natural birds, but bigger than a natural bird would be. Right? So you can do that with your kind of special bond bird type things, your special animals. You can have them be a normal-ish animal, but one that is magically enhanced to be more intelligent, to be bigger, and to be capable of being a companion to your human or elvish or whatever point of view character. But you don't have to go all the way over to creating a telepathic system. So, for example, what I did with my animals that people bond with is I have two different kinds of bonds. So, in my Sangwheel Chronicles bond, how I established it is that the bond is a temporary thing that must be constantly maintained. And this is an interesting thing with bonds is it a permanent bond that cannot be broken like the dragons of Pern, or is it a temporary bond that must be maintained and that the animal can break? Both have great elements to play with. You just need to think about which one will work best for your story. Okay, so I use these snake animals that my people can bond with, and it's from the second book. They're giant snakes that sail across the desert. And the reason why I used them was because I wanted to have desert nomads. But I didn't want to go like Dune and have like full-blown worms or whatever. But I did need some kind of animal that would help these nomads to survive in the desert in terms of the other fauna and flora. So I created these snakes that you can bond with if you are a hobbyer, which is a magic user. So for the people of the desert, the Mosorox is a critical part of their travel. It is the best way to traverse the desert sands, but it's also a good way to keep the rest of the tribe safe, because the rest of the tribe don't travel on the Mosorox. They're not that big. They take a single rider. So but they have animals and they have people and so on, and this desert has got things called Yanari that live under the sands, and these Yanari are very deadly creatures. So the Mosorox provides a protection against that very dangerous animal. The second place where I use a bond is in Magic Fall, which is my science fantasy book, where I have a fleet, which is a flying cat, that is bonded to someone and can follow magic or Jiren people across vast distances. And this comes into play, that ability comes into play later in the book in a very critical way. But what is important here is that I set up in this paragraph, I set up how that bond works. So when my POV character comes out of the building, the day shift light seemed brighter and the street happier. The respirator by itself didn't seem such a chore. Mrrr. The familiar purr came from behind a magnet pod, which idled on the rail with its door lifted high, inviting a passenger to enter. Burry put her hands on her hips. Teacup? Ma? The fleet fluttered into view and landed on her shoulder with a thump. He ran his head along her jaw, purr vibrating through her. Damn it, Teacup, Burry petted him. You can't just break out whenever you feel like it. Frowning down at the fleet, Burry almost regretted taking advantage of the creature's natural ability to track-tune Jiren when she crooned his collar. It had been the first thing she'd ever woven, and she wanted to make sure he could always find his way home. She thrust the memory of happier days at the handloom away and cuddled the soft head under her chin. Now it's me who'll need to find my way home to you. So what I did there, if I switch back here, and the point that I'm making with bonded animals, is that if you're going to create bonded animals, you need to think about how the bond is established, how it interacts with the magic of your world. Is it involved in the magic of your world, or is it a sideways thing? And you need to think about, is it a permanent bond like the Dragons of Pern, or is it a bond that is established and then needs to be worked on? And why does this bond exist? What does this animal give to the culture that it interacts with in this way? What does the animal give and what does the animal get? Like, is this a forced bond that the animal has no choice in, or is it something that the animal also gains a benefit from? Okay, so that's bonds and religion and myths. Let's talk about animals that use magic. So again here, if you're creating your magic system and your magic is an intrinsic part of your world, it is quite likely that you're going to have animals that interact with your magic. Now, what impact does that have on the culture that uses the magic as well? For example, if you look at Avatar: The Last Airbender, you have the dragons who are the original firebenders, and actually you can learn firebending from them. Or the badger moles that are the earthbending creatures that the earthbenders in Ba Sing Se, if I remember correctly, actually use to kind of traverse under the tunnels and so on. So it's worth thinking about what impact animals that use magic have on your culture that also uses magic. Yeah, like telepathic slugs in One Piece world. So yeah, looking at how animals that use magic work is a really important part of determining what the impact is on the culture. Does the culture learn from those animals, or do they potentially just use those animals? So, for example, what I did in my world is I have these animals called blue rons that will carry a message to anyone whose blood they've ingested. But when they get to the other side, they will also demand that they are fed blood to match the blood that they were fed when they were given the message. And this is 100% a magical effect, as is the speed that blue rons can use to cover the distance once they've ingested blood from someone. And it's a unique kind of magical effect of these animals. So it's and obviously this has had quite a dramatic impact on my culture that has access to these blue rons, because they can send reliably messages across the continent that reach each other in a matter of hours rather than a matter of days. And this makes the empire manageable despite its size. So the empire is huge. It's the size of Europe. But because they have the blue ron birds, they can send messages across vast distances, even though they can't travel as fast. So definitely it is worth thinking about your impact on magic using animals. Then you should also consider things like animals that create magic and animals that destroy magic. So first, on the creation aspect, Ursula K. Le Guin has these, not just animals, obviously plants as well, and I'm about to talk about plants, so, speaking of plants. Ursula K. Le Guin has this imminent grove, which is a timeless forest where the roots of the world's magic are believed to reside. It is said that the trees themselves are wise, and that they are connected to all other trees in the world. Now, the imminent grove is on Roke Island, which is connected to the heart of the world and is kind of where magic is at its strongest and so on. But the imminent grove is also kind of the root of magic, according to some readings of the lore. So magic can grow out of your fauna and flora. Now, if that is the case, what happens to that fauna and flora? Do people try to take that plant and grow it in other places? Can it be grown in other places? If it can't be grown in other places, if this is a stationary forest or grove, or an animal that needs to live in a specific environment that cannot be replicated elsewhere, do people move and try and control that environment the way that they do with the spice melange with Arrakis in the Dune series? Do you have wars being fought not over, per se, the taking of the land, but the control of the environment that creates magic because of this animal? So, definitely, that kind of an animal or that kind of a plant would have a dramatic impact on your cultural interactions. The first culture that has control of this piece of fauna or flora would obviously have a massive advantage over all other cultures, because they would have direct access to magic. They would have direct access to something that creates magic, and that is a huge deal. Conversely, someone who learns about this and has a way to combat magic would certainly be very keen to also take control of that grove. They might end up first as a vassal to the people who control this, or it might be that they are able to combat magic and take control of the grove. If, on the other hand, the fauna or flora can be moved, I think you would end up with an industrial espionage situation. And I mean, even if you look at our world, when silk was a huge, when the West encountered silk for the first time, Emperor Justinian of Byzantium sent monks to go steal silkworm eggs and bring them back to the West in the 5th century BC in an industrial espionage act, in order to not have to import silk from the East exclusively. So you would definitely have that kind of industrial espionage to try and get control of that kind of fauna or flora. And then if you had animals or plants that destroy magic, it is worth considering whether that thing would make it, whether it would survive. Would people allow such a creature to survive? Would they perhaps keep it as a reserve to use in times of war? So I can't think of any examples of destruction off the top of my head. So if someone can think of an example from fantasy and put it in the chat of something that destroys magic and how that was handled in world building, it's worth talking about. But I think that there's one of two things. I think either there will be places that don't have magic that kind of keep these magic destroying animals, or these kinds of magic destroying animals will be hunted out and wrecked and ended. Then, of course, Fantastical Fauna and Flora can have a really dramatic impact on war. And again, if we look at A Song of Ice and Fire, we see this here with Aegon and his two sisters, who took control of the whole of Westeros just because they had 3 dragons. I mean, they had some kind of an army, but it wasn't about their army. It was about their 3 dragons. And if you give somebody that kind of advantage, if you give them a flying nuclear device, I pretty much guarantee that they'll make an empire. Like the Valerian Empire, Aegon and his sisters, even Dany at the end there, though I can't even talk about what they did in the TV series. I just can't. But if you give somebody that level of power in an animal, I'm pretty much convinced that they'll end up creating an empire. I think the only reason why, for example, Pern didn't go that way is because the dragons and the riders are supposed to mystically choose effectively good people. That's the idea anyway, that they will choose upstanding people who presumably won't turn their dragons into empire-building monstrosities, which is probably likely what would have ended up happening eventually. So when you're creating your fauna and flora, you do need to think about what impact they will have on war. Think about if these creatures can be used in combat, if they can be tamed, will they dramatically impact war? If they can fly, if they can breathe fire, if they can shoot magic, they're going to impact war. Also, think about what impact war will have on these creatures. Like, if you feed these creatures on war and you bring them up to be warlike creatures, afterwards, what happens to them? Do they become like aggressive, tainted creatures that destroy everything in their path? Or how does that end up working? So think both about the effect that war has on your fauna and flora and the effect that they have on war, and therefore the effect that they have on the culture. Last few contextual notes, just to bear in mind, if you're replacing a niche animal, a normal standard niche animal like a cow or a horse or whatever, the impact on your world is fairly limited. Your culture will use that creature, their language will change, their expressions will change, so they will refer to, instead of saying as strong as a horse, they might say as strong as a fire lizard, if that's what carries them around. But if you're introducing flight, or if you're introducing magical abilities, or if you're introducing advanced combat, things that would almost replace technology as we have it in our world, you should certainly think about the impact that that's going to have on your culture's interaction in war with the rest of your world. Yeah, the Pokemon concept is an interesting one because people capture and bond with these, well, they don't really bond with, they more put these animals in jail, but they do use the Pokemon creatures to create a system where animals are utilized in combat against each other, and people don't fight each other, the animals fight each other. It's an interesting concept, Pokemon. I actually hadn't thought of it in terms of this specific topic, but it's a fair point. Mostly I didn't think of it because I've never really watched Pokemon in full. I just caught a few episodes somewhere in my childhood. But it is certainly worth considering how Pokemon uses animals and the impact that it has on its culture, because Pokemon, the human culture is dramatically impacted by the animals caught in their Pokeballs. Okay, so important things to consider is how it affects communication, how it affects travel, and how your world becomes smaller or larger because of animals. Think about if your fauna and flora interact with your magic, if it interacts with your religion, or if it interacts with your myths and your legends. And if you enjoyed this live stream, you might want to check out my video on creating fauna and flora. And if you want to support the channel, you can get cool shirts like this one off my spring store, or buy any of my books. And otherwise, unless there are more chats, that is that for my live stream. Thank you very much for joining me.